I am thrilled to be here. I feel privileged to be working with you and clear skies ahead. So thanks for having me. So my journey began in 2003 when I was in college as an undergraduate sophomore. I was always curious about flying, going back to the first time I went up in a Cessna 172 with a friend of my father who was a private pilot. I first declared my major in aerospace engineering, and though calculus convinced me pretty quickly I was not meant to be an engineer, I was drawn to aviation. So instead, I worked toward a business degree and decided to try flying recreationally. I found a local Part 61 school, and within about a year, I earned my private pilot certificate and my multi-engine rating. Around that same time, though, I began indulging in alcohol and eventually other substances much more frequently. I remember mentioning it to my CFI a few times and remember him telling me I needed to be sure I was drinking responsibly relative to flying. Of course, he had no way of knowing moderation was just not part of my vocabulary. I started working toward my instrument rating for the first time in 2004, but shortly thereafter, I faced my first significant consequence, an overnight hospital stay and a disorderly intoxication charge. I made a bunch of excuses and I tried to convince myself my drinking was normal college behavior, and deep down I knew it wasn't. Over the next several years, I fought a mostly losing battle with addiction. I was always trying to achieve the moderation that I had been told was necessary. But I stopped flying, setting aside my dreams in favor of what I thought were fun times, which honestly is a decision only an addict can rationalize. The consequences continued, and I entered a 12-year cycle of recovery and relapse. During those years, my physicians treated me with SSRIs for depression, but it didn't help. Over those years, I learned about 12-step programs like AA, but it wasn't until February of 2019, after hitting a new low point, that I finally decided to work an honest program and begin a journey of long-term sobriety. This time, there were no legal consequences. I just gave up any hope that I could ever moderate my using. So fast forward to 2023. I had been working for 20 years in a successful financial services career, which I'm grateful for, but felt unfulfilled. And so I started dreaming again about flying. I was nearly 5 years sober, but I knew my history meant medical certification would be a challenge. Honestly, I did not think that I would be able to fly again. I started researching options and read about the HIMSS program. Uh, I learned that I could consult with a HIMSS AME before submitting my application. So in August of 2023, I met with a HIMSS AME. He was very encouraging and optimistic that I could obtain my medical certification, but was very realistic with me that it would be costly, time consuming, and I needed to be prepared to supply extensive documentation. And he told me the FAA would ask me to do things that I would not want to do, things that I might feel I shouldn't have to do, but that if I stuck with it, I would eventually succeed. So in September, I submitted my application and the AME deferred the decision to the FAA. 45 days later, I received the FAA's request for additional information, and it was overwhelming. I began gathering everything they requested, mostly amounting to medical and court records, but dating back more than a decade. I had a long history at that point, and the process was honestly soul-crushing. It had been a long time since I had thought about, the consequences of my actions over those years. One night, I found myself sitting in the middle of my living room floor, surrounded by the papers, just feeling totally defeated and honestly wondering if I could continue. But I kept going. And one of the requirements was a report from a psychiatrist. So I selected a HIMSS psychiatrist who had immediate availability, but he was out of state. So I got all the records together. I sent them to the FAA. I sent them to the psychiatrist. I met with him. The interview was pretty straightforward. Essentially, it was providing a narrative story to accompany my history, my documented history. 2 months later, he completed his report. My AME confirmed everything was in order, and now we just needed to wait for the FAA. 5 months later, I hadn't heard anything. I happened to be attending AirVenture in Oshkosh, and I learned the FAA had medical representatives there. So I was able to speak to someone. They were able to look up my case, and as luck would have it, the physician who was meant to review my case was actually there. I was asked to come back the next day, and I had this sense of hope that maybe I would have an opportunity to plead my case in person. It didn't quite happen that way. When I returned the next day, the doctor had reviewed my case and rendered a decision. And unfortunately, it was a denial due to my history. I was devastated, but he assured me that it was not a permanent denial, and that there were steps that I needed to take for my case to be reconsidered. Those steps included continuing to see my HIMSS AME while completing 14 random drug tests within 12 months. I wasn't particularly concerned about that because I had already been sober for 5 years. Uh, but the next requirement was to complete an intensive outpatient treatment program, and that was harder to accept. I had been sober for years, but because my recovery was found through 12-step programs, instead of formal treatment, I lacked clinically documented sobriety. And uh, it felt unreasonable, but I could hear my AME's voice from that very first appointment telling me, they're going to ask you to do things you don't want to do. Just do it, and you will fly again. I honestly considered giving up, though. It was requiring a level of humility that I was not sure that I had to go back into a treatment program after being sober for so long. But I decided to move forward, and I found a program near my home that offered evening sessions so that I could continue working full time. It was a bit burdensome, but it was manageable. Miami also introduced the idea of going to Birds of a Feather meetings, and I was familiar with AA, but I did not know about Birds of a Feather, and it's an AA-based recovery group specifically for pilots. And my first thought was, sure, I'll keep doing my 9 to 5 job, go to IOP for 10 hours a week, and drive an hour to an hour meeting every week as well. Sure, I can do that. Um, Surprisingly, though, my attitude shifted after a period of time. After about 3 weeks in treatment and after attending a few birds meetings, I felt a new sense of purpose. I mentioned that I got sober in 2019 through AA, and I attended meetings at least 5 days a week for those first 2 years. But in years 3 through 5, I didn't go very often. Often for months at a time without going at all. And it's because I had lost sight of why it was important to keep going, not to keep myself sober, but to keep helping others. And as a side note, I know everybody going through the SI process doesn't have a history of substance use. There are many other reasons for the special issuance process. And so AA meetings might not be a match for everyone, but I do know there are types of support groups for pretty much everyone, including a group called Fellow Travelers, which is appeals to anyone. So, I encourage anybody that's out there that may not feel like that's a match, just to keep looking and find some sort of support group because it is really important to have a community. Back to my treatment program, I had the opportunity to share my unique experience because I was the only one there that had multiple years of sobriety. Everybody else was just starting. Uh, and I realized that though I had a supportive partner and family, no one in my life really understood what I was going through with this FAA process. And Birds of a Feather changed that. I had a community of pilots in recovery, some professional, some general aviation, just like me. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone. I completed the IOP, I provided the report to my AME, and began the monitoring program. I kept going to 12-step meetings, and I started working with a new sponsor and started sponsoring someone myself. In June 2025, my AME advised me that it was time to resubmit my medical application. So this time it was straightforward. I just completed the Med Express again. He deferred it again to the FAA and assured me that I was in good shape. But I was feeling pretty impatient after all the waiting. And I knew that AirVenture was coming up, so I decided to take another chance and go to Oshkosh and try to speak to someone directly. And I did. A new member of the drug and alcohol team reviewed my file on the spot and told me to come back in an hour. This time, again, I felt very hopeful that I might walk out with my medical certificate in hand. But she told me that although everything looked good, because it had been more than a year since I'd seen that psychiatrist, I needed to go back for a follow-up. So I was very frustrated. The delay was essentially due to the FAA's lengthy process, but she was empathetic, provided her email address, and basically advised me that I could send her the updated report directly. It took 2 more months to get another appointment and for him to complete the report. Once I did, I sent it in, and finally, in October of 2025, 768 days after submitting my original application, I did receive my special issuance letter and medical certificate. So it took a great deal of persistence, some humility and willingness, but in the end, I did make it back to flying. I just hit 250 hours last week, and I'm planning to complete my instrument check ride next month. It's been a long journey, but a fulfilling one. And the journey toward my ultimate goal is only beginning, but I'm very optimistic about my future. And I really hope that my story is one that will provide some hope for others who are going through this process. So thank you for having me here. And Adam, I'll turn it back to you.